The chamber was never warm. Vel had sat in it for 40 years and it had never once been warm. The architects of the Galactic Council had built it to feel eternal. High ceilings, pale stone, light that came from everywhere and nowhere at once, the kind of light that didn't cast shadows because it didn't have a single source. A room designed to make individuals feel small and temporary. It worked on most species. Vel had long stopped noticing. The session had been running for 3 hours. The Vreth motion sat at the bottom of the agenda, which was the Council's way of saying it was the only item that actually mattered. Everything before it had been procedural noise, border adjustments, trade quotas, a mineral rights dispute in the Keth outer sector that had been going for 11 years and would likely go 11 more. The Council was very good at procedure. Procedure was safe. Procedure did not require anyone to make a decision that kept them awake afterward. Then Chair Orith called the motion. Vel straightened in the chair. The language was clean, as these things always were. Pacification appeared 4 times in the document. Threat appeared 9 times, though 5 of those were in the preamble, a preamble that Vel had read 3 times and determined had been written before anyone in this chamber had opened the full species profile on humanity. Vel knew this because Vel had written that profile. Every page of it. The motion itself was simple. Classify Earth as a class-threat civilization and dispatch a pacification fleet. The reason given was that a human deep space probe had drifted past the Keth exclusion boundary 6 months prior. The Vreth executor had labeled this territorial aggression and brought it before the Council dressed in the language of collective security. Vel had a different word for what it was. A shorter one. Mistake. The floor opened for statements before the vote. Vel stood. The speech ran 12 minutes. Vel had learned, over 40 years in this chamber, that emotion was a fast path to being dismissed. So there was no emotion in it. No appeal to fairness. Just data, presented carefully, human adaptation rates, the documented speed at which they reverse-engineered technologies they hadn't invented, the pattern visible across their entire recorded history of responding to existential pressure not by breaking or surrendering but by building, more, faster, with a ferocity that looked from the outside like aggression but was, in Vel's careful reading of it, something more fundamental. Refusal. Not calculated defiance. Not military strategy. Just a deep, structural inability to accept that something was over when there was still breath left to argue with it. Every plague they had survived. Every war that should have finished them. Every moment where the math said stop and they had looked at the math and kept going anyway. The chamber listened in that particular way that meant it had already made up its mind before anyone stood to speak. Vel set. Orith said, "Thank you, Ambassador." The motion proceeds to a vote. 11-1. Vel did not leave when the others did. Sat in the amber maintenance light while the clerks filed out and the Vreth observers moved through the door in their synchronized way. 2 bodies, 1 mind, always slightly wrong to look at. The chamber went quiet in the way that large empty rooms go quiet, which is not silence so much as the absence of any reason to speak. On the desk, a data slate. 40 years of fieldwork lived inside it. Photographs, audio recordings, written observations from 100 cities on a single unremarkable planet in an outer spiral arm. There was a recording Vel had listened to many times, a street market in a city called Chicago. Thousands of voices compressed into 1 block of sound. Dozens of languages. The smell didn't carry through audio, but the density of life did, that particular human quality of pressing everything together and finding it improved by the pressure. There was something underneath the noise in that recording that had taken Vel 4 years to name correctly. Urgency. They lived like they understood that time was limited. Like they had looked at the available data and concluded that it was. Vel touched the edge of the slate. What Vel kept coming back to, across 40 years, was the memorials. Every civilization built monuments to its victories. Humanity built monuments to the things that had almost destroyed them. They carved the names of the dead into stone and placed that stone in the center of their cities, in parks, in squares, on busy streets, where every living person walked past it every single morning. Vel had spent a long time trying to understand this practice. Most species buried their catastrophes, renamed the places, built something cheerful on top of the rubble and tried to move forward. Humans put the wound where everyone had to see it. The conclusion, when it arrived, was this: they kept the losses visible because they did not trust themselves to remember otherwise. Because survival, for them, was not a condition they were born into. It was a decision they had to keep making. And they kept the evidence of why that decision mattered somewhere no one could accidentally forget it. A communications officer appeared in the doorway. Ambassador, the fleet has departed. Vel did not look up immediately. Send a message to the human liaison. The informal channel, not the diplomatic line. A pause. What should it say? Vel set the data slate face down on the desk. Thought about the Chicago market. Thought about a photograph near the back of the file. A human child in a small square of grass behind a house, holding a painted tube that was supposed to be a rocket. 4 meters of ambition and spare parts. The thing launched, traveled 4 meters, hit a fence. The child pumped a fist like it had gone to the stars. Tell them, I tried. The officer left. The chamber held its amber quiet. The ceiling went up and up the way it always did, all that design grandeur working its intended effect on a room that was now empty except for one old ambassador sitting with a face-down data slate. Vel thought about what the fleet would find on the other side of the outer system. Not what it expected. The Council had built its threat model on precedent. Every Level 2 civilization that had been approached, pressured, or confronted had followed the same general pattern. Fear, then signal, then desperate negotiation. The sequence was so consistent it had its own name in Council methodology documents. Humanity had been watching the stars for long enough to know that watching from the ground was not the same as being safe. Vel had flagged this. In 7 separate reports. The most recent one filed 18 months ago, reviewed by no one, labelled non-urgent pending review, placed in a queue behind the Keth mineral dispute. 112 recommendations. 111 filed without action. Vel stood, picked up the data slate, and walked to the door. Turned the chamber lights off on the way out. Not because it was required. Just because it seemed like the right thing to do in a room that had just made a very serious error in the dark. The fleet was already gone. The launch bay of the carrier ship *Grit* smelled like burnt wiring and old coffee, which was exactly what it had smelled like for the 7 years Cole Maddox had been flying out of it. He was sitting in the cockpit of his fighter, pre-flight checklist on his knee, on item 14 of 40. He had been on item 14 for 11 minutes. Every time he got there, something made him go back to item 1 and start over. Outside the bay doors, past the magnetic seal and the dark, an alien fleet was crossing the outer edge of the solar system. Item 1. Hull integrity check. The *Grit* was not a beautiful ship. LT. Nate Okafor, who had designed the hull in a basement in Atlanta over 3 long winters, had once said that beauty was what happened when you had time and money left over after function. The *Grit* had neither. It was grey and angular and shaped, one reporter had written, like a storage container that had been in a fight and won. The comparison had been meant as an insult. The crew had printed it on coffee mugs. Item 4. Fuel cell pressure. It had been 30 years since Owen Baxter, a signals analyst from a listening post in New Mexico, decoded a fragment of Deep Space Comms traffic and brought it to his supervisor at 3 in the morning, shaking. The message had been encrypted in a format humans hadn't invented. What Baxter translated, after 6 months of work and 1 complete nervous breakdown, amounted to *the ones in the outer arm are not ready and it should be done before they are *. The message was not addressed to anyone human. It had been passing through, the way light passes through a window without meaning to. Washington, Beijing, Brussels, and Moscow were told simultaneously. For once in recorded history, they all said the same thing at the same time, which was a word that cannot be printed but which expressed, very accurately, the general situation. Then they started building. Not peacefully. Not with any kind of optimism about how things might turn out. They built the way you board up windows before a storm, because the storm is coming whether you board the windows or not, and boarding the windows is the only thing left to do with your hands. Item 9. Weapons array sink. For 30 years, the Sol Defense Corps had been constructing in the dark. Stations hidden behind asteroid density. Weapons platforms tucked into Jupiter's upper atmosphere, disguised in the sensor profile of a mining operation. Ships built in underground facilities and transported in pieces through the belt. Admiral Mara Voss had overseen the last decade of it from a chair in a room with no windows, drinking terrible coffee and reading enemy formation theory the way some people read novels, for pleasure, and to understand how it ended. The fleet that had just entered the outer system was expecting a frightened civilization. They were going to find something else. Cole got to item 14 again. Started over. Item 1. The tactical display to his left was live. He could see the alien fleet's position updating in real time as Sol Station Vigil's long-range sensors mapped the formation. 11 ships. Large. Built for overwhelming force rather than maneuverability, which was the choice you made when you expected the other side to break quickly. Spread in a textbook approach pattern, which told Cole they had done this before, approached, displayed force, waited for the signal that said the other side understood. They were waiting for that signal now. They were going to wait a while. Cole looked at the display, at the shape of the formation, at the distances involved and the math of what was about to happen. Gorgeous, he said, very quietly. To no one in particular. He meant the formation, the geometry of it, the scale. He meant the fact that they had come, that the thing everyone had spent 30 years building for was actually here. He meant that he was so afraid his hands had stopped shaking and gone completely still, which was what happened to Cole Maddox when fear got large enough. It passed through panic and came out the other side as a very focused calm, like the eye of something. He meant all three things at once and said none of them because none of them were Item 1. Item 1. Hull integrity check. On the tactical display, the alien fleet came to a full stop. Cole's hand stilled over the checklist. For a long moment nothing moved. Not the fleet, not Cole, not the 37 other pilots in their cockpits in the bay around him. All of them watching the same display. All of them understanding the same thing at the same time. The alien fleet had stopped because Sol Station Vigil's long-range sensor array had just gone fully active. And the moment it had, the full shape of what humanity had been building for 3 decades became visible in the scan. 400 vessels, 12 deep space stations, 2 asteroid installations. The weapons array in Jupiter's atmosphere that Nate Okafor had built from a recycled mining platform, 3 years of work, and an idea that everyone told him was too stubborn to function and which had been functioning for 18 months without a problem because stubbornness turned out to be a solid engineering principle. The alien fleet stopped and stayed stopped. They were doing the math. Cole watched them do it. Watched the formation hold position. No advance, no retreat, no signal. Just 11 ships sitting very still in the outer dark while the numbers came back wrong compared to what they had expected to find. The math kept being the same math. He got to Item 14 on the checklist. Went back to Item 1. Then Admiral Mara Voss's voice came through on the fleet-wide channel. No speech. She was not a speech person. No rallying cry or prepared words about history or the weight of the moment. Just a voice that was very flat and very dry and had been drinking bad coffee in a windowless room for 10 years waiting for exactly this. They stopped. Good. Means they can count. A pause. Maddox wing, launch. Cole put the checklist on the seat beside him. He would finish it later. He had always known, on some level, that he was never going to finish it. He hit the launch sequence and the bay doors opened and the dark came in and they flew out into it. 38 fighters from the Grit alone, and behind them and above them and below them, hundreds more from carriers spread across the belt, all of them coming online at once, all of them filling the dark between planets with the sound of engines that a civilization had spent 30 years building and never yet used. The alien fleet still hadn't moved. Cole flew toward it. Gorgeous, he said again. He meant it differently this time. Executor Cass ran the numbers for the 3rd time. The numbers did not change. Numbers did not change. That was the fundamental, reliable truth of numbers, and in 22 years of command, Cass had never once found comfort in a truth more complete than that one. The numbers said the humans should have stopped. The numbers were not explaining why the humans had not stopped. The Vreth fleet had entered the Sol system expecting a Level 2 civilization, orbital platforms, perhaps a small defensive ring, the kind of military infrastructure that existed because every species eventually looked up at the sky and understood, on some deep level, that the sky went both ways. Cass had seen it many times. The pattern was consistent. There was always a fleet. There was always a signal moment, the moment the smaller civilization sensors registered the full size of what they were facing and the math became clear. Then there was the pause. And after the pause, the signal. The signal that said, "We understand. We will discuss terms." What had happened instead was this. The moment the Vreth fleet came to a stop in the outer system, a strategic pause, standard procedure, giving the humans time to perform their calculations, the entire Sol defense grid had come online. Not piece by piece. All at once. 400 vessels. 12 stations. Weapons platforms in positions that the Council's pre-mission survey had listed as mining infrastructure, which meant someone had been lying about infrastructure for a very long time, and had been very good at it. CAS had run the numbers, sent new orders. The fleet advanced with appropriate caution into the asteroid belt, using the rocky density for formation cover in the way that Council tactical doctrine recommended for entry into contested space. Then the asteroids started moving. Not randomly. Not from impact or gravitational drift. The rocks were being moved deliberately, steered by magnetic installations buried inside them, turned into projectiles, 40-ton, 100-ton projectiles launched with accuracy that CAS's sensor operators reported with a flatness in their voices that meant they were working very hard not to sound alarmed. 3 Vreth cruisers took direct hits in the first exchange. 1 was disabled. 2 were destroyed. The humans lost 6 fighters. By Council doctrine, loss thresholds were the language of war. You announced your flaw, the point at which losses became unacceptable and retreat became the rational choice, and you fought until you reached it or your enemy reached theirs. It was not cruelty. It was efficiency. It was how civilized species conducted conflict without consuming themselves entirely. Every member of the Council fought this way. The Aethali, the Keth, even the Vreth, for all their collective aggression, had flaws. CAS ran the loss model for the humans. A level 2 civilization, fighting its first interstellar engagement, with demonstrated emotional investment in self-preservation. Flaws should appear between 8 and 15% casualties. Beyond 15, psychological and material collapse became statistically unavoidable. The humans hit 12%. They flew faster. CAS recalculated. Extended the model. Adjusted for combat adrenaline, the documented human tendency toward what their own literature called fight or flight, weighted toward flight in survival scenarios. The humans hit 17%. A full fighter wing went dark on sensors, destroyed or disabled in a coordinated attack on the fleet's portside column. Before CAS could reallocate, the gap the wing had left was filled by 3 Sol Defense Core carriers that had been sitting completely cold and invisible inside an asteroid cluster for what the battle recorder later estimated was at least 4 months. 4 months. They had sat cold and dark inside a rock for 4 months waiting for a fight they weren't certain was coming. CAS ran the loss model again. It returned the same flaw. The same estimate of the point at which human forces would recognize the tactical reality and begin negotiating. One of CAS's cruisers was hit by a human fighter traveling at maximum speed with no weapons active and no engines on the wing. Just the hull, used as a projectile, the pilot ejecting less than a second before impact. The portside engine column of the cruiser collapsed inward. On the recovery channel that CAS's communications officer had been monitoring, someone asked the pilot if he was alive. The pilot said yes. Then the pilot laughed. It was not the laugh of someone who had just survived something. CAS had heard that sound from many species, that high, trembling release that came from a body that had expected to be dead and was surprised to find itself still functioning. This was not that. This was the laugh of someone who had done something they had wanted to do for a long time. Then, one by one, on the human fleet's open channel, other pilots started laughing too. CAS stayed with that for 3 full seconds, an eternity in combat calculation, and found no framework for it. A hive mind processed loss as a collective. When a unit of the Vreth collective was destroyed, all remaining units felt the reduction, a small dimming across the whole. Losses were not abstractions. They were felt, measured, responded to. The idea that a pilot would laugh after losing a fighter and nearly losing the body that operated it had no category in CAS's tactical library. The humans were at 22% fleet casualties. Their aggression metrics were still increasing. CAS pulled the fleet back to the outer edge of the belt and ran the numbers for the 4th time. The calculation was clear. The humans would not stop at any threshold CAS's models could identify. They would not stop because they did not appear to have a flaw, not one that worked the way flaws were supposed to work. Their losses seemed to function, somehow, as fuel. Every ship they lost made the remaining ships press harder. Every pilot who didn't come home made the pilots still flying angrier and faster and more willing to do things that weren't in any tactical manual CAS had ever read. There was a human carrier ship with the name *grit* welded across the front of it in plain block letters. It had sustained significant damage. It kept moving forward. CAS held the fleet at the belt boundary and opened a channel to Council Command. The message was 7 words, which was 7 more than CAS usually needed. The model does not cover this species. Then, before Council Command could respond, something else happened on the tactical display that CAS had not anticipated. Something that had not been in the pre-mission briefing, the Council threat assessment, the 7 recommendations filed by Ambassador Vell, or any prior engagement record for any species in the Council's 4,000-year history. The human admiral opened a ceasefire channel. She did not ask for a ceasefire. She offered one. The message was short. The tone was flat. It did not sound like a species that was fighting for its life. It sounded like a species that had finished doing what it came to do and was now deciding, at its own discretion, whether to continue. Cass looked at the tactical display for a long time. The humans were at 23% casualties. They had not slowed down until they chose to. Cass accepted the offer. Not because the math said to. The math didn't say anything useful anymore. Because the alternative was continuing a battle against a species that laughed at 22% losses and had been hiding carriers inside asteroids for 4 months on the off chance that someone was going to show up. The fleet sat still in the outer belt. Somewhere on the other side of the ceasefire line, a pilot was asking for a new ship. Cass heard this on the open channel. Didn't know what to do with it. Filed it under the same category as the laughter, a growing collection of human behaviors for which there was simply no existing framework and which would, Cass was beginning to understand, require the Council to build one from scratch. That was going to be a very long project. The neutral station smelled like recycled air and something faintly chemical that Elise Carr had never been able to identify in 3 years of Ethelite diplomatic work and had stopped trying to identify because some things, it turned out, you just learn to breathe. She stood in the corridor outside the negotiation chamber and did what she had been doing since the shuttle docked, which was not panicking, technically, because she had decided very early in her career that if she was going to do this work, panic was a luxury she simply couldn't afford. So what she was doing instead was counting ceiling tiles in an alien space station corridor and finding that they didn't use tiles, they used continuous panels, and the counting exercise wasn't working. Inside the chamber, Dana Lark was about to sit across a table from the Galactic Council. Elise had known Dana for 4 years, had watched her run 3 Security Council sessions, 2 closed-door crisis meetings, and 1 extremely tense debrief after the belt engagement where 3 generals had tried to talk over her and she had waited, very still, until they finished, and then said what she was going to say anyway. Dana Lark from Iowa, who wore her authority the way people wore comfortable shoes, not as something to display, just as something that made moving easier. The Council had no idea what was waiting for them in that room. Elise checked the data packet one more time. 47 pages. Clause 7 was on page 31. She had read it 6 times since Nate Okafor had sent it to her on an encrypted line from Sol Station Vigil with a message that said, "Asterisk found something in the Council's own IP law. Might be useful. Tell me if it's too much." Asterisk she had written back immediately. Asterisk it's perfect. Never tell anyone how you found it. Asterisk. She went inside. The chamber was a long oval, walls the pale grey-green of Ethelite architecture, the table running its full length with seats on both sides. The Council delegation was already seated, Chair Orith in the centre, 2 Keth diplomatic advisors on one side, a Vreth observer via remote screen at the far end. Vel sat in the corner, slightly removed from a table, present as a neutral observer. When Elise came in, Vel looked at her. The expression was one she had learned to read over years of study, something between vindication and exhaustion, which in Ethelite was a single facial state that didn't have a clean equivalent in English. She had translated it for herself once, privately, as, asterisk I told them. Asterisk. Dana came in 2 minutes later with 1 aide and the data packet. She sat, set the packet flat on the table, folded her hands on top of it, and waited while Orith arranged papers. Orith opened with the prepared statement. Vel had warned Elise about this. The Council would open with conciliation, with the language of mutual misunderstanding, with the framing that placed the belt engagement in the category of regrettable but understandable procedural error rather than attempted destruction of a sovereign species. The language would be careful. It would cost nothing to deliver and was designed to soften the room before Orith moved to the Council's preferred terms, a negotiated settlement, limited reparations, some kind of conditional framework for future engagement. Orith said, "The Council recognizes that the events in the Sol system arose from a misapplication of standard threat assessment protocol, which in hindsight." Dana set the data packet on the table. She didn't open it. Just set it there. Let it sit. "I'm sure," she said. Orith's secondary breathing membrane made a small movement. Elise watched it. "The Council is prepared to discuss a path toward normalized relations." "Good," Dana said. "So are we." "We wrote it down." She slid the packet forward. What followed was 11 seconds of silence while Oratha's aide opened the packet and began to page through it. Elise counted the seconds. She was very good at counting things that she was not allowed to react to. The terms were not a peace treaty. Dana had been specific about this in the briefing. A peace treaty implied two parties with approximately equal standing negotiating from mutual need. That was not the situation. The situation was that the Galactic Council had dispatched a military fleet to pacify a civilization without a declaration, without prior diplomatic contact, and without reading the full species profile that had been sitting in their own filing system for 40 years. The situation called for something different. It called for a bill. Full reparations for every vessel damaged or destroyed in the belt engagement, itemized by ship, calculated at replacement cost. Immediate full membership in the Galactic Council, with voting rights, effective upon signing. Council withdrawal from 3 border sectors within 90 days. A formal written apology, entered into permanent council record, accessible to all member civilizations indefinitely. And Clause 7. Nate Okafor had found it buried in the Council's own intellectual property statutes, which were extensive and had been in place for 800 years and which the Council had assumed no non-member civilization had ever read, because non-member civilizations generally didn't have access to Council legal archives and also generally didn't have a chief engineer in Atlanta who treated legal documents the way other people treated puzzles. The statute was clear. Any technology observed, scanned, or recorded by a Council vessel during an engagement with a non-member civilization was subject to IP protections under Council law if that civilization subsequently achieved member status, retroactive to the date of first contact. The Vreth fleet had spent the entire belt engagement scanning every piece of Sol Defense core technology they could get sensors on. Weapons systems, hull configurations, the Jupiter array, the cold-running carrier trick. All of it recorded in perfect detail by 11 ships full of very sophisticated scanning equipment. All of it now belonged, retroactively, to humanity, with licensing fees. Orath reached page 31. Elise watched the breathing membrane. It fluttered. She looked at the ceiling, kept her face where it needed to be. From the corner, Vel made a sound. A small sound, entirely through the nose, that in 40 years of fieldwork had never made it into any of Vel's official diplomatic reports because it was undignified and Vel was a professional. It was, as close as Elise could translate, the Etherly equivalent of a laugh you were working very hard to keep inside. The negotiation lasted 3 sessions over 2 days. Not everything was resolved in the room. The reparations took 6 months of back and forth. The border sector withdrawal was eventually modified to 2 sectors and a shared monitoring agreement. But the framework held, and by the end of the 3rd session, Orath had signed where indicated, and the data packet was on its way to Council permanent record. Elise walked out into the corridor after the final session, leaned against the wall, let herself breathe. Vel found her there. You knew about the IP clause before you arrived, Vel said. It was not a question. Nate found it. Elise looked at the ceiling. He said if they were going to spend the whole battle scanning his work, they could pay for it. Vel was quiet for a moment. 40 years, Vel said. I spent 40 years writing reports about your species. Did you get it right? Vel considered this with the genuine seriousness the question deserved. I understood the aggression. I understood the refusal to accept a calculated loss as final. A pause. I did not anticipate the invoicing. Elise nodded slowly. Outside the station windows, the dark stretched in every direction, the way it always did, indifferent and enormous and full of civilizations that had just learned something new about the species in the outer arm. Neither did we, honestly, she said. That was all Nate. The council chamber ceiling was very tall. Dana Lark had been looking at it on and off for 2 hours, between agenda items, the way you look at something when the thing you're actually thinking about doesn't have a visible shape. The architects had built it tall on purpose. The same principle as the rest of the building, height as a kind of pressure, a reminder that the institution was larger than any individual sitting inside it. She wondered if it had ever worked on anyone. 6 months had passed since the belt engagement. 6 months since the 3rd negotiation session, the signatures, the slow and somewhat tense process of the council implementing terms it had agreed to and was not entirely at peace with. Earth's seat at the council table was new enough that the chair still had that particular stiffness of furniture that hadn't been broken in yet. Dana had sat in a lot of chairs over a career in public service. She sat in this one the same way she sat in all of them. The session today was administrative. Border adjustment confirmations. A trade protocol update affecting 3 member civilizations in the inner cluster. A very long motion about agricultural licensing rights that had apparently been on the agenda since before human beings had figured out metallurgy, and which was finally being resolved today through a procedural mechanism Dana had read about the night before and found genuinely interesting, which made her aware that this job had already changed her in some small but permanent way. She voted on all of it. Correctly. Having read every document in the packet sent to her office the week prior. The Etherly representative across the table had glanced at her twice during the agricultural vote with an expression Dana was learning to recognize. The council equivalent of mild surprise, the specific flavor of it that meant, asterisk you did the reading. Asterisk she was gathering that not everyone did. She was gathering that this was, for reasons she found baffling but was going to use, considered remarkable. The Vreth item came up near the end. It was listed on the docket as Administrative Motion 7C, Procedural Record Amendment. Dana had read it in her office 3 days ago, set it down, and then stood at the window for a few minutes watching the stars from the station's observation port, which was something she had been doing a lot since she arrived. They looked different from here. She had expected them to. Orith presented the motion. A formal request to expunge the original pacification vote from Council Permanent Record. The reason given was procedural inconsistency, a paperwork argument that held up technically but which everyone in the room understood was the Council's way of quietly erasing a very large mistake from its own official history. Dana seconded the motion before anyone else could speak. The room went still in that particular way that council rooms went still. Not silence exactly, but a pause, a collective moment of recalibration. On one condition, Dana said. She set a single sheet of paper on the table. Her aide had printed it. Dana had written it herself, the night before, on the third draft, after the first 2 had been longer and said the same thing with more words. In place of the expunged record, the Council enters a standing resolution. Any member proposing military action against a pre-contact civilization must first complete and submit a full documented review of that civilization's military history. She looked at Orith, then at the Vreth remote screen. All of it, she said. The pause stretched. On the remote screen, the Vreth observer was very still in the way that hive minds went still when every individual within the collective was processing the same thought at the same moment, which was a distinctive quality of stillness that Dana had been told about by Elise and now found she could recognize. The thought they were all having was this: if this resolution had been in place 6 months ago, someone would have been required to read the full human military history before the vote. The full history. All of it. From the first recorded conflicts through to the 30 years of classified construction in the asteroid belt. Someone would have had to read it, document it, and submit it for review. That review would have taken approximately 8 months, during which time the fleet would not have been authorized to depart. The resolution passed. Dana signed the papers, passed them to the clerk, looked at the ceiling for a moment. Later, 3 years later, as it turned out, she would be told that the resolution was known informally across the council as the Lark Clause. She would say only, "Well, shoot," and then ask if anyone wanted more coffee, and the subject would close. But that was 3 years away. Right now there was the rest of the session, more administrative items, and the slow careful work of being a new member of a very old institution that was still deciding how to feel about her presence. She did the work. All of it. She had always done the work. In the artificial evening, when the station's light system shifted to the amber cycle that stood in for sunset and the session chambers emptied out, Vel found her in the small observation bay near the end of the residential corridor. The bay had a wide curved window that looked out at what Vel called the deep dark and what Dana called, without much ceremony, space. Vel brought 2 cups of something warm that was approximately a drink, in the sense that it was liquid and served hot and made the inside of Dana's chest feel slightly less like it had been carrying a heavy object for 6 months, which was accurate. You surprised them today, Vel said, seconding their own motion. Conditioning it. Dana looked out the window. The stars from here had no twinkle, no atmosphere to move through. They just sat in the dark, steady and permanent and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in the past 6 months in the small system on the outer arm. Did you ever think you were going to lose? Vel asked. Dana held the cup with both hands. The warmth helped. Every day, she said. That's why we built so many ships. Vel made a sound through the nose, the one Elise had described to her, the one Vel had reportedly been holding in since page 31 of the negotiation packet, 6 months ago. Dana lifted her cup. They stayed there a long time in the way that two people can sit in quiet when they have both been, each in their own way, the only person in a series of rooms who was asking the right questions. The dark outside didn't move. Stars never moved, from a station. That was something Dana was still adjusting to, the stillness of it. From Earth, the sky turned. You could stand in a field in Iowa and watch the whole thing rotate around you, slow and enormous and present in a way that made you feel small but also, somehow, held. From here at just Saturday. She was getting used to it. Somewhere on the other side of the station, Cole Maddox's replacement fighter requisition was working its way through Seoul Defense Corps paperwork. He had filed it the day after the ceasefire. The ship was going to be the same model as the one he'd turned into a missile in the belt. Same hull, same ugly angles, same general resemblance to a container that had opinions. He had named it on the requisition form under the field labeled * vessel designation *, in the plain block letters that the * grit * used. Gorgeous . The paperwork was going to take 3 weeks. Cole was going to spend those 3 weeks complaining about it to anyone who would listen, which was how Cole Maddox expressed patience, which was what he'd been doing his entire life, which was why he was still alive. Dana didn't know about the requisition yet. She would hear about it later, from Elise, who had heard it from Nate, who had been the one to approve the name because he was technically Cole's commanding officer for equipment purposes, and he thought it was funny and also correct. She would laugh when she heard it. For now she just held her cup and looked at the stars that didn't move and let the quiet be quiet, which was something she had not had much of lately and which felt, at this particular moment, like exactly enough.